In the history of popular music, Debbie Harry was not just a singer, but an icon who defined an entire era. With her role as the lead vocalist of Blondie, she helped bring new wave and punk rock out of the underground clubs to become a global phenomenon. Songs like Heart of Glass, Call Me, One Way or Another, and Rapture not only topped the charts like Billboard, but also changed the way the world viewed popular music, especially when Rapture became one of the first songs to bring rap into the mainstream flow. Blondie has sold more than 40 million records worldwide, a number that affirms their timeless influence. In 2006, Debbie Harry, along with the band, was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, marking their solid position in American music history. Not stopping at music, she was also a fashion and cultural icon, influencing many generations of artists afterward, like Madonna or Lady Gaga. Her career spanning more than 6 decades is proof of her resilience, creativity, and rare ability to adapt in an ever-changing industry. But behind all those achievements, Debbie Harry never really had an easy or complete journey. That dark night in New York was not just a fleeting memory, but a silent scar that followed her throughout her life. The feeling of standing at the edge of disappearance left a fear that was not easy to name, a vigilance that crept into every decision afterward. She continued to move forward, continued to sing, continued to stand under the lights that millions admired. But inside there was always a part of her that had changed forever. When her life partner and co-founder Chris Stein fell seriously ill, she quietly set everything aside to care for him, accepting the trade-off of her career and the spotlight. When Blondie disbanded, she faced the silence that no applause could fill. And as time passed, without her own family, without a real place to return to, Debbie Harry still continued to live, not because everything had become easier, but because she never allowed herself to collapse. Her will did not lie in avoiding pain, but in carrying it with her and still continuing to raise her voice, even when no one truly understood everything she had to go through. Before continuing with the story, please hit like and leave a heart as a quiet way to acknowledge what Debbie Harry has had to carry throughout her life. Not everyone can remember the first moment of their life, but for Debbie Harry, what haunted her was precisely having nothing to remember. She came into this world in silence, then left the arms of her biological self also in silence when she was too small to understand what had happened. There was no explanation, no complete story, no final glance back. There was only an invisible void placed right from the very first days. A void that for many years afterward she still could not name. The adoptive family that raised her were kind people. They gave her a stable home, a life without material shortages, full meals, and a childhood that from the outside seemed to have nothing to complain about. But there were things that could not be filled by stability. And Debbie gradually realized that in a very quiet way, there were evenings when the house became quiet. When there were no more voices or footsteps, she would sit alone and feel something very hard to understand creeping into her heart. It was not clear sadness, nor a specific fear, but a feeling like she was standing outside her own life, as if she had been placed into a story where she was not the main character. As she grew up, questions began to appear, not loud but persistent. Why was I not kept? Why did someone look at me and decide to let go? No one in the adoptive family could answer those questions, and Debbie herself understood that some questions were not born to have answers, but the lack of answers did not make them disappear. It only made them stay longer, deeper, and quietly shape the way she saw the world. At school, she learned to fit in, learned to smile, learned to become part of the group. But there was always a small gap that no one could see, a gap that made her never fully belong to where she stood. Those around her might call it independence, call it personality, but inside, it was a very primal fear, the fear that if one day she was no longer good enough, she could be left behind once again. There were very small moments, almost insignificant to others, but they stayed with her for a very long time. Like when seeing a child being tightly hugged by their biological parents, like when hearing someone talk about their family with a certainty she never had. In those moments, Debbie did not react, did not show anything on the outside, but inside there was a question repeating over and over. If I was let go once, what guarantees that it will not happen again? That question did not make her weaker, but it kept her in a state of readiness, always keeping just enough distance so that if she lost something, she would not completely shatter. It was from there that another need gradually formed. Not to be loved, but to be seen. If she could not be sure she would be kept, then at least she wanted to make sure she could not be forgotten. She began seeking recognition from things outside herself, from the eyes of others, from feedback, from anything that could prove she existed. It was not vanity, but a way to fill the void that had been there too early. And even though at that time she did not yet know music would become her path, the need to be heard, to be felt, had already begun from those very early years. Debbie Harry did not grow up in deprivation, but she grew up in a void that no one could see. A child who was raised with everything provided, but always carried the feeling that she could be given back at any time. And perhaps that was exactly what made her strong in a very special way, not because she was not afraid of loss, but because she had grown used to the idea that loss could happen at any moment. From a child with no memory of where she began, Debbie learned to create meaning for her own existence, little by little, in silence. But deep inside, the first question of her life had never truly disappeared, and it would continue to follow her, slipping into every choice, every relationship, every step afterward, like a reminder that there are wounds that do not need to be seen to exist forever. As she grew older, that feeling did not disappear but only became clearer in Debbie Harry's life, like a background sound that never fully turned off. Adolescence should have been the period that shaped her identity, where a person begins to understand who they are and where they belong. But for Debbie, it was the phase where everything became the most blurred. The house where she grew up was still there. Meals still happened on time. Family conversations continued like a familiar rhythm of life. But inside her there was always a distance that could not be named. She did not rebel, did not act out in a loud way, but there was always a part of her mind that stepped back, observing her own life as if watching a role being played. It was not because she was not grateful, but because she could not feel the complete connection that others could easily call family. Those years, Debbie began to realize that external stability could not replace the feeling of belonging on the inside. She tried to fit in, tried to become part of everything around her, but there was always a very thin boundary that she could not cross. Conversations sometimes felt distant. Moments that seemed intimate did not leave a deep impression. No one said it out loud, but she sensed that she was living in a space she had never fully touched. And the more she tried, the more she realized there were things that could not be built by effort alone. The meeting with her biological mother, something many people might imagine as a healing reunion, happened in a different way. There were no tears, no outpouring, no feeling that a missing part had been found. Instead, there was a stillness, almost cold, when two people stood in front of each other without knowing what to say to fill the gap of many years that had passed. Debbie saw the person who had given birth to her, but she did not find what she had hoped to feel. There was no natural bond, no sense of familiarity, only a confirmed truth. She had an origin, but that origin did not give her a place to return to. That moment did not make her collapse, but it clarified something she had probably felt for a very long time. Some people are born with a clear starting point, while she did not have one. And when there is no solid starting point, finding a place to belong becomes much more difficult. Debbie no longer searched for answers in a desperate way like before, but that absence still remained, quietly influencing the way she viewed every relationship. If a deep connection could not form even in that situation, then what could make her truly attached to anyone or anywhere? It was during this period that a shell began to form. It was not artificial, but a self-protection mechanism. Debbie learned to show confidence, learned to keep just enough distance, learned not to let others see the most vulnerable parts of herself. She constantly found ways to control her own image, not to impress, but to avoid being put in a position where she could be hurt again. The strength that others saw was not her original nature, but the result of many years of learning to exist without relying on any solid anchor. Meanwhile, another path began to open, not as a clear choice, but as a natural reflex. Debbie began to turn toward art, not because she already knew what she would become, but because it was the only place where she could express things without needing to explain. Art did not require a clear origin, did not demand a complete story, and did not ask questions she could not answer. There, she could exist in her own way, without needing to fit any mold. Music, image, style, all began to become tools for her to build a version of herself that she could control. If life had not given her a clear identity from the start, then she would create it herself. Not to completely replace the real person, but to have something more solid to hold on to. And over time, the boundary between the real person and the image she built began to blur, to the point where even she found it hard to distinguish which part was which. Debbie Harry's teenage years were not loud, did not have obvious events that others could easily notice, but they contained a profound process of change. From a child carrying a question without an answer, she became someone who learned to live without needing answers. But the price of that was a lingering sense of alienation. A feeling that no matter where she stood, she was only there temporarily. And that very feeling would follow her as she stepped into the outside world, where lights, music, and people would give her the chance to be seen, but did not guarantee that she would truly be understood. New York came to Debbie Harry, not like a promise fully kept, but like a door opening in the night, where light and darkness existed at the same time, without anyone warning what was waiting on the other side. She left behind what was familiar with the hope that this city would give her something clearer, a chance to find out who she was, to step into a place where the feeling of belonging was no longer as distant as before. But New York in those years was not a dream, but a constant challenge, where everything moved too fast for a person to keep up with where they stood. The crowded streets, the neon lights, the packed bars, all created a rhythm that swept away anyone not strong enough to hold themselves in place. And Debbie, even though she was already used to feeling lost, still had to learn from scratch how to exist in a place where no one was really waiting for her. She took every job she could to survive, not to pursue passion right away, but just to keep her life from falling apart. The long shifts, the money earned just enough to pay rent, the hurried meals in silence, all became part of the new rhythm of life. There were days when she stood in front of the mirror and did not recognize who she was trying to become, only knowing that if she stopped, everything would vanish. Jobs like waitressing, secretarial work, or modeling did not give her a sense of stability, but were only temporary stops in a journey with no clear destination. This city did not ask where she came from, nor did it care where she was going. It only set one requirement: if you want to exist, you have to hold your own place by yourself. But what made New York feel heavy was not just the pressure to survive, but the feeling of always being watched, always being judged, as if every step was under the gaze of a world that was not very kind. Those glances that swept by carried no concern, but only measurement, comparison, and sometimes contempt. Debbie learned to walk faster, speak less, and keep a shell around herself that was not easily breached. She understood that in a city like this, weakness was not something that could be shown. But no matter how hard she tried, there were still moments when she could not control what happened around her. That night was not an exception, but a clear reminder of what she had always felt. When the strange man approached, there was nothing too unusual on the outside, but there was something in the way he looked, the way he spoke, that made Debbie feel uneasy. The offer to get in the car was not spoken as a threat, but it was enough for her to understand that she was standing in front of a very fragile boundary. That moment stretched on as if endless, when everything around seemed to recede, leaving only her and the decision she had to make. No one appeared to intervene, no sign that the situation would end on its own. Only instinct, the only thing she could trust. When she refused and stepped back, it was not because she was sure she was safe, but because she had no other choice. The feeling of fear did not disappear right when she left there. It followed her through every street, slipped into every thought, making everything around sharper, more suspicious. That night ended, but it did not mean it closed. It became part of the way she saw the world, part of the way she understood that there were things she could not control, and she was not always protected. From after that moment, Debbie no longer saw this city in the old way. New York was not a place that would save her, not a place that would bring answers to the questions she had carried since she was little. It was only a space where she had to exist on her own, make her own decisions, and take responsibility for everything that happened. That did not make her leave, but it changed the way she moved forward. She became more cautious, more closed off, and understood that if she wanted to find anything meaningful, she would have to create it herself. In that chaos, one thing began to become clearer than ever. If the outside world did not give her a place to belong, then she would have to find it somewhere else. And it was precisely in the most difficult days, when everything around seemed to have nothing certain, that Debbie began to direct her attention to the one thing that did not betray her. Art, not like a grand dream, but like a way to keep herself from being swallowed by the emptiness. This city did not save her, but right in its heart, she began to find a path where at least she could walk without having to ask herself where she belonged. Amid the breathless rhythm of the city that promised nothing, Debbie Harry began to hold on to the one thing that did not turn its back on her. Music, not like a brilliant dream, but like a thin rope that helped her not fall into the familiar void that had followed her since she was little. Those evenings, stepping into crowded clubs where cigarette smoke mixed with the smell of cheap beer, Debbie stood in front of sparse audiences, sometimes only a few people, sometimes just glances that swept by and turned away. There was no recognition, no long applause, only songs that rang out and dissolved into the space as if no one kept them. But she still sang, not to become famous, but to make sure she was still there, still had a voice, still had a sign of existence. There were nights when her voice was almost swallowed by the noise around, but it was in those moments that she felt something very real. When she raised her voice in song, she did not disappear anymore. The rejections came more often than the opportunities. Record labels were not interested. Doors closed faster than she could knock. People said that voice did not fit, that style had no place, and that face should stay in photos rather than on stage. Each time like that, Debbie did not react strongly. She just silently accepted it, in the way she had grown used to not being chosen from very early on. But that silence was not giving up. It was a form of endurance, a decision to keep moving forward even when there was no sign that the road ahead would lead anywhere. She continued to appear in places where no one was waiting for her, continued to sing songs that maybe no one would remember, as if every time she stood on stage was an affirmation that she had not yet been erased from this world. Then one day, among all those unfamiliar faces, she met Chris Stein. It was not a special moment in the way people usually tell it, with no light or sound signaling that something important was happening. It was just a meeting, a glance long enough to realize that someone was truly listening. Chris did not look at Debbie like an image that needed to be judged, nor did he try to define her by any standard. He looked at her like a person trying to exist, and that, for Debbie, was a rare experience. For the first time, she felt there was someone who did not need her to prove anything to be accepted. They began making music together, not with grand goals, but simply because it was the place where both could be themselves. Those days were not easy, with no money, no guarantees, only practice sessions in cramped spaces, unfinished ideas, and a very fragile belief that what they were doing had meaning. From there, Blondie gradually took shape. Not like a carefully planned project, but like a natural response to everything they had been through. It was the sound of people who were not chosen, not waited for, but still decided to raise their voices. Debbie stood on stage with Blondie not like a star, but like someone trying to keep herself from falling into the void. The performances were still small, the audiences still few, but something had changed. She was no longer completely alone. Music was not just a place she hid in, but became a place where she could share, even if only with a few people who were truly listening. Each song was a part of what she could not say in words, each melody a way for her to place herself in the world without needing to explain why she was there. There were nights when she stepped down from the stage. Everything returned to the way it was. The city was still cold, the streets still unfamiliar, and the future still unclear. But the feeling had changed a little. She knew there was a place, even if small, where she was not lost. Not because the world had changed, but because she had found a way to exist in it. Music did not erase what had happened, did not completely fill the void inside, but it gave her a reason to continue. And perhaps the most important thing was not where she would go with music, but the fact that she had not disappeared before that happened. In a world that had many times made her feel she could be left behind, Debbie Harry had found a way to stay, to be heard, to prove that her existence was not just a faint trace. Music did not save her from everything, but it kept her here long enough to keep moving forward. There were relationships that did not start with promises, but with a feeling that was very hard to name, as if two people accidentally stepped into the same rhythm without needing to explain why. For Debbie Harry, that happened when she was with Chris Stein. Not like a bursting moment, but as a presence that gradually became irreplaceable. After years of having to keep herself at a safe distance, for the first time she did not need to defend herself completely. Chris did not try to define Debbie, did not require her to become a more understandable version, and that very thing created a form of connection she had never had before. They did not just talk about music, but lived with it, letting it seep into the most ordinary moments, from unhurried mornings to long nights, staying up with unfinished melodies. They began building Blondie, not from a clear plan, but from what they had in hand at that time. Very little money, very few opportunities, but with a belief they could not explain. The practice sessions took place in cramped spaces where the sound rang out imperfectly, but real enough to keep them there. Debbie no longer stood alone in front of a strange room. She stood with someone who understood why music mattered so much. Chris was not just a companion, but became part of the way she saw the world, part of the way she felt about herself. And in those days, even though life was still full of difficulties and there were nights when she did not know what tomorrow would bring, one thing had changed. Debbie no longer felt she was drifting without a stopping point. Their life did not have much that could be called stable, no guarantees others could rely on, but it had a very own kind of peace. They ate simple meals, moved between small venues, played music in places where no one was sure anyone would listen. But in all of that, Debbie felt a connection she had never had before. It was not a feeling of being complete, but a feeling of being accepted in an unfinished state. And for someone who had grown up with the question, "Where do I belong?" that meant more than any success. Music and love began to blend together until they could hardly be separated. The songs were not just products of creativity, but the result of what they were living. Each melody carried a part of the emotions they did not speak. Each performance a time they affirmed their existence, in front of a world that had not yet really paid attention to them. Debbie did not need to pretend to be strong when she was with Chris, nor did she need to hide the vulnerable parts of herself. In that space, she was not an image, not a role, but just a person trying to live truly with what she felt. But along with that connection was a worry that never completely disappeared. There were things that, when they became important enough to be the center of life, also meant they could become the thing one feared losing the most. Debbie did not say it out loud, but she felt very clearly that if one day this changed, she would have to face the void she had tried so hard to leave behind. The fear of being abandoned did not disappear. It only changed shape, becoming more subtle, slipping into every thought, every quiet moment. There were nights when everything seemed stable, and she still wondered how long all of this could last. Yet, despite that worry, Debbie still chose to stay, still chose to believe in what she had, not because she was certain about the future, but because the present, for the first time, gave her a feeling closer to belonging than anything before. Music was no longer just a way for her not to disappear, but became a place where she could exist with another person without needing to explain why. And in the small world they created, between the imperfect songs and the uncertain days, Debbie Harry for the first time felt that she was not just living, but truly present. When the door opened for Blondie, everything did not come gradually like the years before, but rushed in at a speed that even Debbie Harry could not keep up with where she stood. The small performances gradually turned into big stages, the half-empty rooms gradually became crowds with no space left, and the music that had once been just a way for her to exist now began to ring out everywhere. On the radio, in clubs, in spaces she had never thought she would step into. Heart of Glass was not just a song, it became a milestone, pulling along a chain of success that no one could stop. Call Me, One Way or Another, Rapture, each track a step further into the light, where Debbie Harry's name was no longer an unknown in the underground scene, but became an icon mentioned everywhere. But when the world began to look toward Blondie, that gaze did not stop where Debbie had once hoped. She became the face representing them, the center of every spotlight, the one journalists, photographers, and audiences turned to first. Everything revolved around her, from magazine covers to posters, from interviews to the stories told. But the more attention she received, the more Debbie realized that what the world was seeing was not completely her true self. They looked at the blonde hair, the eyes, the style she had built, but they did not look at what had shaped that person. They called her an icon, a model, the face of a generation, but few asked who she really was when the lights were off. The questions she received became less and less related to music, and more about her appearance, style, and how she presented herself to the public. There were interviews where Debbie felt she was answering for an image that had already been created, a version of herself that others found easier to understand. It was not that she was not proud of what she had built, but there was a very clear difference between being recognized for her true self and being tightly bound to an image others wanted to see. And as time went on, that boundary became more and more blurred. The pressure began to appear not from the music, but from maintaining what the world had gotten used to seeing. Each time she stepped on stage, each time she appeared in public, Debbie carried not only her voice, but also an invisible expectation. She had to keep that style, had to continue being the image people had loved, had to not change in a way that confused them. The things that had once been natural expressions now became something that had to be maintained. And in that process, Debbie gradually realized that there were parts of herself that were no longer as free as before. There were moments, amid a cheering crowd, when she felt a very strange stillness. It was not because there was no sound, but because there was no real connection. Thousands of people could call her name, sing along to her songs, but that did not mean they understood her. They knew the image, they knew the music, but they did not know what lay behind it. And Debbie, who had once desperately wanted to be seen, now stood in a world where she was seen everywhere, but not recognized in the way she had once hoped. Chris was still there, still the one who understood her in a way no one else could, but even that began to face pressure from the changes around them. Life was no longer the simple days like before, when everything revolved around music and the connection between the two of them. Now there were schedules, responsibilities, and factors they could not control. Debbie still stood on stage, still sang, still was the center of every gaze, But a part of her began to wonder if all of this was taking her further away from herself. The world had finally turned its eyes toward Debbie Harry, but not in the way she had once hoped. She was no longer invisible, but that did not mean she was understood, and in the brilliance of the lights, in the long applause, Debbie began to feel a different kind of loneliness. No longer the lost feeling in silence, but the lost feeling right in the middle of the most crowded places. The lights did not turn off after the performances. They followed Debbie Harry into every frame, every magazine cover, every interview, as if the world had decided to keep her in one single angle. When Blondie reached its peak, Debbie was not just the vocalist. She became a seductive icon that the media and audiences kept repeating. The lenses turned to her first. The headlines named her first, and gradually every story was told around her appearance, style, and aura. No one denied her talent, but what was emphasized did not lie in the music. The questions turned to her hair, her eyes, her outfits, the way she entered a room. That attention at first felt like an open door, but then it became a fixed frame, where Debbie had to stand still for others to look at. The gazes lingered longer than usual. The pauses in conversations when the person opposite seemed to be measuring every detail on her face. All of it made Debbie realize she was being turned into an image, something that could be admired and consumed, but did not need to be understood. There were days when she looked back at photos of herself and saw a version that was too clear, too sharp, but unfamiliar. That image was beautiful, exactly what people expected, but it did not tell the whole story. It did not speak of the years standing in the shadows, did not mention the questions that never had answers, did not contain the fragile feeling she still carried. Debbie began to feel a gap between her true self and the image the world held onto. Each time she appeared, she had to step into that role, had to keep everything consistent, had to make sure nothing deviated from the mold people had gotten used to. And in that process, parts of her gradually receded, not disappearing completely, but no longer present as clearly as before. The pressure did not come from a specific demand, but from the constant repetition of expectations. If today she was seen this way, tomorrow she had to keep it the same. If one image was loved, it had to be recreated. If a style became a signature, it was not allowed to change too much. The things that had once come from nature now became part of the responsibility. Debbie did not just sing, she also had to maintain a presence that millions had grown familiar with. And each time she stepped out, she knew she was being compared to her own image from yesterday. The fatigue did not come immediately. It accumulated over time, slipping into the short breaks between trips, between shows. There were mornings when she woke up and felt she needed a moment of quiet, but the schedule did not allow it. There were times she wanted to talk about music in a deeper way, but the conversation was pulled back to more accessible things. Gradually, she began to hold back, began to speak less, to keep more inside. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because she was not sure those things would be heard. Amid all that attention, Debbie realized something she had never thought about before. Being seen did not mean being understood. The eyes directed toward her did not always seek the real person, but often stopped at the surface, and when that repeated long enough, it created a very strange feeling, as if she was standing at the center of everything but not completely present there. She could hear the applause, she could see the admiration, but she did not always feel the connection. Chris remained an anchor in that world, someone who did not look at Debbie through the lens of the crowd. But even when there was a place to return to, the pressure from outside did not stop. It followed her into the studio, into small decisions, into the way she thought about herself. Debbie began to wonder whether what she was doing was still a free choice or had become a reaction to what others expected. There were moments on stage when the lights shone straight on, making everything around fade, and Debbie felt as if she was standing in a very private space. There, the music was still there, the voice still rang out, and in those short few minutes she could return to the initial feeling, the feeling that had made her start all of this. But when the song ended, when the light changed, reality returned with all its demands, and Debbie stepped off the stage with a feeling that was not easy to name. Not sadness and not joy, but a light emptiness, as if a part of her had just been used up and needed time to come back. Gradually, she understood that the price of being desired lay not only in what she had to show, but also in what she had to keep for herself. Not everything could be shared. Not every emotion had a place in a world that always wanted things clear and easy to understand. And in that process, Debbie Harry continued to move forward, continued to appear, continued to be the image that millions knew, but inside, she kept a part that no one touched, a part that was still finding a way to exist, not as an icon, but as a human being. Those days when success once brought a feeling of being recognized, now gradually turned into a non-stop rhythm of life for Debbie Harry, when the touring schedule stretched on continuously like a flow that did not allow anyone to step out. One city followed another, one stage followed another, and amid all that movement, time began to lose its clear shape. There were mornings when she woke up in a strange room, needing a few seconds to remember where she was, then quickly getting up because the schedule did not wait. The flights, the sound checks, the interviews, all connected to each other until there was no space left to breathe. Music was still there, but the way it existed in her life had changed. It was no longer a place to take shelter, but became part of the machine she had to keep up with. The exhaustion did not come immediately, but accumulated day by day, night by night, slipping into her body and mind in a very quiet way. Debbie still stood on stage with the same energy the audience expected, still sang the songs they had loved, still kept the image the world had grown familiar with. But behind those moments was a body that was beginning to tire, a mind that no longer had enough quiet space to process everything that was happening. There were nights after the lights went out, when the applause faded away. She sat alone in the room with nothing special happening, but also no feeling of peace. It was just a prolonged emptiness, where everything seemed to have been used up without time to recover. The life around her was full of people, from the band, the crew, the audience, to new faces appearing every day. But amid all those presences, Debbie began to feel the lack of something very basic, real connection. Conversations became shorter, more work-oriented, and rarely touched what was deep inside. She could be surrounded by dozens of people, but still feel she was standing alone in that space. Relationships formed quickly and also faded quickly, without enough time to become something lasting. Even with Chris Stein, the one who had once been the place where she felt understood, everything began to change under the pressure of this new life. It was not because they no longer cared about each other, but because the time they had for each other was increasingly narrowed. The practice sessions that once stretched with focus and connection now got squeezed in between a dense schedule. Private moments became rare, and when they appeared, they often came with fatigue rather than full presence. They were still together, still making music together, but there were silences between the two of them that had not existed before. No one said it out loud, but both felt that what had once been very natural was now something they had to try to hold on to. Debbie no longer had much time for herself. The quiet moments that once helped her think, once helped her understand where she was, were now replaced by constant movement. There were no more unhurried mornings, no more long evenings without a schedule. Everything was planned, arranged, and she moved within it like part of a larger system. There were times she wanted to stop, wanted to break away from it all, but she did not know where to begin because everything had become too familiar in a way that was not easy to change. Success, the thing she had once pursued as a way to affirm her own existence, now began to carry a different weight. It was not just songs topping the charts or sold-out shows, but a responsibility to maintain, a rhythm to keep steady. Each time she stepped on stage was no longer just a choice but something expected, and the more people expected, the greater the pressure. Debbie realized she was not just singing for herself, but for everything others had attached to her image. There were very short moments when, standing in the middle of a song, when the lights shone down and everything around temporarily faded, Debbie could still touch the initial feeling, the feeling that had made her star to all of this. But those moments did not last. They came and went, leaving behind a reality she had to keep facing. And in that reality, success was no longer a destination, but a prolonged state where everything had to keep moving. Whether she was ready or not, gradually Debbie began to understand that the price of achieving everything she had once searched for lay not only in what she had gone through, but also in what she had to continue to endure. Success did not take music away from her life, but it changed the way music existed in it. It was no longer a complete shelter, but became part of a larger system where she had to keep everything going. And in that process, Debbie Harry still stood firm, still continued to move forward, but carrying a feeling that not everyone could see, that sometimes what you achieve is exactly what keeps you from being able to return to where you once belonged. There was no clear sign warning of the collapse, no single moment when everything broke apart, only small changes that began to pile up until Debbie Harry realized that the world she had grown familiar with no longer existed in the old way. Amid the dense tours and the non-stop rhythm of life, Chris Stein's health began to decline. At first with signs that were hard to notice, longer periods of fatigue, silences during practice sessions that had not been there before. But then, everything became clearer when pemphigus was diagnosed, a rare and dangerous disease that made his body weaken quickly. For Debbie, it was not just medical information, but a change that shifted the entire orbit of her life. The days before that, everything revolved around music, stages, and expectations from outside. But now all of it pulled back into a smaller space where each day was measured by Chris's health condition. Debbie stopped, not because she wanted to, but because there was no other choice. Shows were cancelled, plans were left behind, and everything that had once seemed impossible to stop now had to make way for something simpler but also heavier: staying. She moved from standing in front of thousands of people to sitting by a hospital bed, from keeping the rhythm for a band to monitoring every breath of a person she could not lose. The outside world continued to move, but for Debbie, time seemed to slow down, stretching out in uncertain days. Meanwhile, Blondie could not continue to exist as before. The band that had once been the center of everything now gradually disbanded, not because they wanted to end it, but because circumstances did not allow them to continue. Members went their own ways, plans were abandoned, and an important chapter in Debbie's life closed without a clear goodbye. There was no carefully planned final show, no official moment to say that everything had ended. It was just a prolonged silence where the music stopped without anyone knowing exactly when. Financial pressure began to appear in a way that Debbie could not ignore. Previous success did not guarantee long-term stability, and when income from music stopped, reality became clearer than ever. The costs for treatment, for daily life, for all the things that had previously been covered by the spotlight now appeared in concrete terms. Debbie was no longer just an artist. She became someone who had to worry about very real things. Numbers, decisions that she had not had to face in this way before. That did not make her panic, but it added a layer of pressure that she had to carry every day. Life changed completely in a very short period of time, so fast that Debbie had no time to adapt step by step. What had once been the center was no longer there, and what had once been in the background now became everything. She no longer moved between cities, but moved between thoughts, between worries about tomorrow. There were no more shows to focus on, no more applause to fill the silence, only a reality she had to face without distraction. There were days when she felt she was standing between two worlds, an old world she could not return to, and a new world she did not yet fully understand. Caring for Chris was not a burden she reluctantly accepted, but a choice that came from the deep bond between them. But that did not make everything easier. There were moments when she saw the changes in his body, when she realized that not everything was within control, and that feeling brought a different fear, deeper and quieter. Debbie had grown used to not being protected, but witnessing someone important to her weakening day by day was a different kind of challenge, a kind of loss that happened slowly but no less heavy. Gradually, she realized she had lost more than one thing. It was not just a band, not just the old rhythm of life, but an entire system that had once kept her life running in a familiar way. The stability she once had, even if imperfect, had still been an anchor, and now that anchor was gone. Debbie did not collapse in an obvious way. She did not stop completely, but there was a change in the way she existed. Everything became slower, deeper, and heavier. In that silence, with no music to cover her thoughts, no crowd to blur her emotions, Debbie had to face everything that remained. And in that process, she understood that collapse did not always come with noise. Sometimes it came in silence, in small changes that, when looking back, had altered her entire life. She lost her career in the way she once knew it, lost the stability she had once relied on. But she still stayed, still continued, not because everything had been resolved, but because she did not know any other way to exist except to keep moving forward. In the prolonged silence after everything had broken apart, Debbie Harry did not leave. She stayed by Chris Stein as a decision that needed no further consideration, not because there were no other choices, but because she could not do otherwise. Her days were no longer measured by tour schedules or audience numbers, but by very small signs of stability. A morning without fever, a meal kept down, a sleep without interruption. She became the only support in a space where everything was fragile, where every change could bring an unforeseen consequence. There were no more lights, no more moments when the world turned toward her. Debbie lived in a different rhythm, slow, heavy, and full of attention to the smallest details of each day. There were times she realized she was repeating the same actions, caring, monitoring, waiting, then continuing, as if time had shrunk into a chain of similar moments following one another. Her career, which had once occupied most of her life, did not disappear completely, but receded very far. Like something belonging to a different time, the songs still existed, the recordings were still played, but Debbie was no longer at the center of all that. Invitations, opportunities, and reminders of the past still appeared, but she could not respond in the way people expected. It was not because she no longer loved music, but because there were more important things happening right in front of her. The spotlight that had once covered every step now felt distant, almost unrelated to the reality she was living. And in that process, Debbie not only gave up what she had built, but also gave up the version of herself tied to those things. The exhaustion did not come from a single moment, but accumulated through each day and each incomplete night. There were times she felt she was moving through days without really stopping anywhere, as if everything happened in a continuous flow she could not separate from. Thoughts were no longer as clear as before, emotions no longer easy to distinguish, all blending together in a hazy state. Debbie still continued, still did what needed to be done, but inside a part of her began to tire in a way that was not easy to recover from. It was not the fatigue of the body after a show, but the fatigue of a mind that had to maintain alertness in a situation with no clear end. The love between her and Chris did not disappear during that time, but it changed shape. It was no longer the days of creating music together, sharing ideas together, but became a quiet presence, a wordless commitment. Debbie did not need to say she would stay. That was shown through every day she did not leave. But love, no matter how deep, could not solve everything they were facing. There were limits no one could overcome, things that care could not change. And it was in those moments that Debbie realized loving someone did not mean being able to keep them whole as before. There were nights when everything was temporarily calm, when there was nothing that needed to be done immediately. Debbie sat and felt a very strange emptiness, It was not because she had nothing left, but because she had spent so much energy keeping everything from falling apart that there was not much space left for herself. She began to realize she no longer knew clearly who she was when she was not in the role of caregiver, not in the state of reacting to what was happening. The parts of her that had once been expressed through music, through the stage, now felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. Gradually, the feeling of losing herself did not come as a shock, but as a slow process. Debbie did not completely lose who she was, but there were parts that were pushed to the back, making way for what was necessary in the present. She no longer had much time to think about the big questions, no longer had space to rediscover the things that had once been important. Life shrank down to concrete things, things that had to be done, things that had to be held on to, and within that scope, Debbie continued to exist. But even in that state, she did not completely abandon what had made her who she was. There were times when music came back, not on stage, but in very private moments. A melody that passed by, an incomplete line of a song. Those things were not enough to bring her back to her old life, but they were enough to remind her that there was still a part of her that had not disappeared. And perhaps those small parts were what helped her continue, not with a clear goal, but with a quiet resilience. In the process of loving someone and keeping them here, Debbie Harry had lost many things she once thought would always be there, not because she chose to give them up, but because circumstances had changed everything in a way she could not control. But she still stayed, still continued, not because she did not feel the loss, but because she did not know any other way to exist except to hold on to what was left, no matter how little it was. When the long days of caregiving gradually came to a close, when the rhythm of the crisis no longer rushed as before, Debbie Harry's life did not immediately open up to something new, but fell into a prolonged silence that she had to learn again how to live in. There were no more constant trips, no more dense schedules, no more evenings when she had to stand under the lights and keep the energy from dropping. Everything suddenly slowed down in a way that made her almost not recognize herself. The initial silence brought a feeling of lightness, as if a great pressure had been lifted. But then that very silence gradually became a larger space, where there was nothing left to cover the thoughts she had not had time to face before. The room was no longer full of the sound of music or people's voices, but only small noises, enough to remind her that life was still going on, but not in the way she had once been used to. The stage lights, which had once shaped every rhythm in her life, now became a distant memory rather than a reality. There was no applause, no eyes directed toward her, no feeling of having to keep everything at its highest level. That should have brought freedom, but for Debbie, it also brought a question she could not avoid when she was no longer standing in that role. Who was she? With no more shows to prepare for, no more songs to perform, no more interviews to answer, she had to create a new rhythm of life for herself without clear guidance. And that, in a way, was harder than stepping onto a stage in front of thousands of people. With no family of her own to return to, no stable structure to hold on to, Debbie stood in a space where everything could change without a fixed anchor. The relationships that had existed during the busy years began to thin out. Not because of a clear break, but because a natural distance appeared when the rhythm of life was no longer the same. The people who had been there for work, for music, for shared projects now went their own ways. There was nothing wrong with that, but it left a void that was not always easy to fill. The calls became fewer, the meetings became rarer, and Debbie realized that some connections only existed when everything was still moving. The loneliness she had once felt in the crowd now returned in a different way, no longer loud, no longer hidden by music or lights, but present clearly in each day. There was no one there to call her name, no one requiring her to appear, and for a period of time that made her face herself more than ever. There were mornings that passed without a specific plan, evenings that stretched without a highlight, and in those times, Debbie had to find a way to exist without relying on what had once kept her standing. But that emptiness was not completely an ending. It was a different beginning. Even if unclear and not easy, Debbie did not return to music right away in the old way, did not try to recreate what had been lost, but started from smaller things, decisions that did not define her entire life, but were enough to create a direction. She tried again, slower, more carefully, no longer driven by outside expectations but by an inner need to keep herself from disappearing in the silence. Rebuilding her life from almost nothing did not happen as a planned process, but as a series of small steps, sometimes uncertain, sometimes repeated. There were days when she felt she was moving forward, days when she felt she was standing still. But gradually, a new rhythm formed. Unlike before, it was not fast, not loud, but there was one truth she could recognize. She was still there, not in the role the world had grown used to, but in a space where she had to redefine herself. Debbie did not deny what had passed, did not try to separate herself from the past, but she also did not let it hold her back completely. The memories of the stage, of music, of the people who had walked with her were still there, but they no longer occupied all her thoughts. Instead, she learned to exist in the present, even if that present did not bring the same clear feeling as before. And in that process, the loneliness did not disappear, but it changed shape from something that made her feel separated to a part of the space she learned to accept. After everything that had collapsed, there was no one standing on the other side waiting for her to return, no door already open for her to step into. But Debbie Harry still continued, not because she knew for sure what she would find, but because she had grown used to moving forward without guarantees. And in that silence, between days no longer marked by lights and music, she began to rebuild a life that for the first time was not defined by what others saw, but by what she chose to keep for herself. Time passed without bringing any clear rearrangement to Debbie Harry's life, but only highlighted more what had existed for a very long time. When looking back, she realized that she did not have a home in the way many people understood it. No children growing up in her own house, no evenings gathered with a family built over many years. The choices, the circumstances, and the things beyond her control had brought her to a point where life was not defined by traditional bonds. That did not make her feel lacking in a simple way, but it created a different kind of silence, where questions without specific answers still existed. The relationships that passed through her life were not without meaning, but they rarely lasted in a way that could be called permanent. There were people who came very close, sharing profound moments, but then circumstances changed, time pulled them away, and everything ended without a clear milestone. Debbie did not blame anyone. She understood that her life always moved to a different rhythm, a rhythm that was not easy for keeping someone around for the long term. But each time a relationship receded, no matter how gently, it still left a trace, reminding her that connection was not something she could hold on to forever. There were times, in very quiet periods, when Debbie felt herself returning to the image of herself as a child, the child who had once been handed over without understanding why. It was not a specific memory, but a familiar feeling, an emptiness that had not completely disappeared even after so many years. She had built a life, had stood in front of millions of people, had been named and recognized, but the deepest part of her still carried an old question, a feeling that she could be separated at any moment, that no longer frightened her as before, but it was still there, quietly shaping the way she viewed everything. Success, when viewed from the outside, seemed like the answer to everything she had been searching for. But when standing inside it, Debbie realized that it did not bring the connection in the way she had once hoped. It brought attention, brought opportunities, brought a position not everyone had, but it could not replace the feeling of belonging. The rounds of applause did not extend until she returned home. The praises did not fill the gaps when everything became quiet. Success helped her exist in the eyes of others, but it did not completely help her find a place to stop. Her life did not have a stable anchor in the ordinary sense. There was no fixed structure to return to, no schedule built around family relationships, no space where everything was always there, no matter what happened. Instead, Debbie existed in a flexible state where everything could change, where she had to create stability from uncertain things. That required a form of strength that not everyone could see, an ability to continue even when there was no guarantee that things would stay the same. But that strength did not erase the gaps. There were days when everything seemed stable, where she could look back and see a life that had been lived fully in its own way. But there were also days when the silence became clearer, where questions that did not need to be spoken still remained. It was not regret, but an awareness that there were things that had not happened, paths that had not been chosen, and possibilities that had never become reality. Debbie did not try to fill all those gaps, because she understood that not everything needed to be completed. Instead, she learned to exist with them, as a part of the story she could not change. The gaps were no longer something to avoid, but became part of the space she lived in. And in that space, she continued to move forward, not because everything had become clear, but because she had grown used to living without needing to know for sure where everything would lead. A life without roots does not mean a life without value, but it carries a different feeling, a different way of existing, where each step is not held by a fixed foundation, but is held by the decision to continue. Debbie Harry had gone through many stages, had experienced many changes, but at the deepest level, she was still someone searching for a form of connection that did not always appear. And perhaps, continuing to exist in the unfilled gaps had become the most important part of the way she lived, not as something that needed to be solved, but as a reality she had accepted to carry. Time did not come to Debbie Harry like a shock, but like a slow flow that changed everything in an irreversible way, little by little, until she realized that the familiar rhythm of life was no longer there. The days were no longer pushed by a dense schedule, no longer pulled by back-to-back tours, but slowed down in a very clear way. Mornings arrived lighter, evenings stretched longer, and between those two periods were silences she had never had the chance to experience before. This slowing down was not a choice, but a reality. And in that reality, Debbie began to look back at her life, not through big milestones, but through the gaps she had passed without stopping in time. The years before had been marked by success, by music, by moments when the world turned toward her. But when looking deeper, she saw parts that had not been filled, things that had not happened, connections that had not been kept. It was not only what had been lost in a concrete sense, but also opportunities that had passed and could not return, paths that had not been chosen, and possibilities that had never become reality. Time did not take everything all at once. It took it gradually, leaving behind a feeling that was very hard to name, not completely regret, but also not complete peace. There were moments when Debbie remembered the early days, the small performances, the people who had once been very close, and realized that not everything was still there. The memories became clearer over time, no longer covered by the fast rhythm of life as before, but appeared with full details. Like puzzle pieces, she could see more clearly when everything around had settled down. But memories, no matter how clear, could not change what had happened. And that brought a deep awareness that there were things that could not be taken back, could not be redone, could not be fixed. Debbie did not try to resist that, did not try to hold tightly to what had passed, but gradually learned to accept reality in a quieter way. There were no more strong reactions, no more need to explain or prove, only a calmer existence where she stood in her own life without needing to change it into something else. The silence was no longer a frightening void as before, but became part of the space she understood and accepted. And in that space, Debbie Harry continued to live, not with the goal of finding what had been lost, but with the awareness that what remained, even if imperfect, was still part of the journey she had gone through. At the age of 80, Debbie Harry no longer stands at the center of big movements like before, But she is still there, in a quieter space where time passes without needing to prove anything. A long life stretches behind, full of moments that others might call glorious, milestones that music history still mentions. But when looking from the inside, all of it does not appear as a series of victories, but as a journey with many layers of intertwined emotions. Some brilliant parts, some quiet parts, and some parts that are never spoken. She is still remembered as an icon of Blondie, a vocalist who shaped an entire era, an image that many generations still hold in their memories. But her current life no longer revolves around those things. There are no more dense schedules, no more back-to-back performances, no more constant presence in front of the public. Debbie lives in a different rhythm where everything happens slower and deeper. The space around her is not noisy, not full of the sounds of a life pushed by external expectations, but carries a stillness enough for her to clearly hear her own thoughts. Music is still there, not disappeared, not left behind, but it exists in a different way. No longer the center of everything but a part of life, a part she can touch when needed but no longer bound to maintain at the highest level. The songs still play somewhere, in spaces where she does not necessarily have to be present, and that creates a very clear distance between her current self and the image the world still holds. Debbie does not deny what has passed, but she also does not try to live in it again. Her personal life is not shared much, not because there is anything that needs to be hidden, but because there is no longer a need to put everything under the light. What remains is not big events, but small moments, days that pass without clear highlights, but carry a very real presence. Memories of the past do not disappear. They become part of the way she sees the world, part of the way she understands herself. There are days when she remembers the streets, the stages, the faces that were once very close, and realizes that not everything is still there, but memories no longer pull her back. They just exist, like a background layer that she does not need to change. There is a feeling that Debbie does not need to name, but it is always present. A feeling that no matter where she is, no matter how many stages life has gone through, there is still a part of her that does not completely belong anywhere. It is not loneliness in the painful sense, but a familiar state, a way of existing that she has carried for a very long time. She does not try to solve it, does not try to fill it with new things, but accepts it as part of herself. There are people who find stability in family, in long-term relationships, in clear structures. But Debbie's life did not follow that path, and that, over time, is no longer something that needs to be changed. What remains is not a list of achievements, not numbers or awards, but the experiences that have shaped who she is, from the early days with no memory of where she began, to the years searching for a way to exist, to the moments standing in the lights and realizing that attention does not mean understanding. All blend together to form an inseparable story. Debbie does not need to retell that story for it to have meaning. It already exists in the way she lives, in the way she moves through each stage. And even though everything has changed, even though the rhythm of life is no longer as before, she still continues to move forward, not because there is still something to achieve, not because there is still something to prove, but because that is the only way she knows to exist. What remains in her heart is not always clear, not always easy to understand, but enough to keep her in the present. The world may still remember Debbie Harry as an icon, a vocalist, an image shaped over many years, but the person living in the present is not completely the same as what is kept in that memory. At the age of 80, she is still here, not disappeared, not effaced, but also not completely within what others think of her. There is a distance between the image and the person, between the past and the present, between what has been remembered and what is still happening. And in that distance, Debbie Harry continues to exist, not as a complete answer, but as a journey that has not yet stopped. Even if it is no longer marked by clear milestones, The story of Debbie Harry does not cause pain because of loud tragedies, but because of a form of silent loss that lasted throughout her entire life, beginning from the moment she was given away when she was too small to understand and continuing to be present in every stage after that. From the dark night in New York, when she almost disappeared without anyone knowing, to the years standing in front of millions of people but still feeling unseen. Then the period when she gave up everything to care for Chris Stein when he got sick. Every detail shows a person who always chose to stay, always chose to endure rather than leave. What makes the story profound is not that she succeeded with Blondie or was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but that those achievements could not fill the void from the feeling of not belonging. A person who can be called by name by the whole world, but still carries loneliness from childhood, reflects a familiar reality in American society, where individual success is often celebrated, but inner wounds are easily overlooked. The biggest lesson is not trying to stand out to be recognized, but understanding that a person's value should not depend entirely on the gaze of others. Debbie Harry did not collapse, not because life was easy, but because she accepted carrying those gaps and still continued to live. This reminds us that in a society that always values achievements and images, what is more important is staying true to oneself and not losing oneself in the process of seeking recognition. If the story of Debbie Harry makes you slow down a bit, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a quiet way to acknowledge a life that has gone through so many gaps and still did not stop. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to listen to stories that sometimes no one really tells.